Let me give you some background first. The house is fairly new, built about 10 years ago. When we moved in, we did a major renovation, including installing brand new hickory hardwood floors. If you've ever put in hardwood floors, you know that installers sometimes leave small gaps between the floorboards. This is intentional, especially in humid climates, because when humidity rises, the wood expands and fills those gaps. Without them, the boards could buckle and form humps, which is a nightmare to fix. Here in our area, which gets its share of muggy summers, those gaps are a necessity. The flip side, though, is that when the humidity drops and the wood dries out, the boards can shrink and make popping or cracking sounds. It's a sharp noise, almost like a snap, and it can sound eerily like footsteps if you're not used to it. A lot of folks complain about this when they first get hardwood floors, mistaking the creaks for someone walking around. But once you live with it for a while, you learn to distinguish the random pops of the wood from actual footsteps. When we redid the floors in my mom's house, the largest gaps were left in her bedroom, so that's where the loudest noises came from. Her room is on the second floor, and when she walks from her bed to the bathroom or out into the hall, you can hear the distinct rhythm of her steps. Steady, deliberate, a little heavier on the right foot because of an old knee injury. I live on the first floor, in a room directly below hers, so I hear her moving around pretty clearly. The sound travels through the ceiling, muffled but unmistakable. I've since moved into my own place, not too far from Mom's, but I still stay over at her house sometimes. Her neighborhood, while nice, has a reputation for break-ins, and she feels safer when I'm there, especially since I'm a big guy, 6'1", about 200 pounds. She likes having me around to keep an eye on things. Fast forward a few months after the reno, and I'd gotten used to the sounds of the house. I could tell Mom's footsteps from my sister's lighter, quicker ones, or the random cracks of the floorboards settling. But one night, something threw me off. I was in my room downstairs, messing around on my laptop, when I heard what I swore were Mom's footsteps. The familiar creak of her walking from her bed, across her room, and out toward the living room. The house has an open concept layout, so her master bedroom doors open directly into the living room, which flows into the kitchen and dining area. It's all one big space, great for family gatherings, but not exactly soundproof. I didn't think much of it at first and kept scrolling. But when I glanced at the clock, it was 3 in the morning. Why the heck was Mom wandering around at 3 a.m.? Curious and a little annoyed, I decided to go upstairs and check on her. Both of us had work in the morning, and I figured she might be stressed or sleepwalking or something. But when I got upstairs, the living room was empty. No lights, no Mom, nothing. Her bedroom doors were closed, which was odd because I just heard her walk out. I stood there for a second, confused, then grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen and headed back to bed. I chalked it up to the floorboards playing tricks, but it nagged at me. Those steps had sounded so much like hers. The next morning, I asked Mom if she'd been up wandering around at night. She looked at me like I was crazy and said no, she'd been asleep. I told her about the footsteps, and she brushed it off, saying it was probably just the floors. But I wasn't convinced. The rhythm, the weight of the steps, it was too close to how she walked. This wasn't just a random pop of wood. Still, I let it go. Maybe I'd imagined it. But it kept happening. For over a month, on and off, I'd hear those same footsteps at odd hours, always around 2 or 3 a.m. Sometimes Mom would even complain about hearing steps in her room while she was lying in bed, which freaked me out because I'd hear them too, assuming it was her moving around. We started wondering if something was off. Her neighborhood's history of robberies didn't help, so we decided to beef up security. We installed a home security system with motion detectors and sensors on every door and window. If anything opened, a loud chime would ring through the house, impossible to miss. We figured if someone was sneaking in, we'd know. The footsteps kept happening, though, and the security system never went off. No chime, no alerts, nothing. It was baffling. We checked the system, tested it, and it worked perfectly. So what was making those sounds? I started to doubt myself, wondering if it really was just the floors. But deep down, I knew better. Those steps had purpose, like someone walking with intent. Fast forward to yesterday. Mom and my sister decided to take a 2-week trip to Europe, leading me to house sit. I was fine with it, free food, fast Wi-Fi, and a chance to keep an eye on the place. But last night, things took a turn. I was in bed around 2 a.m., half asleep, when the security system's chime blared through the house. It's a piercing sound designed to wake you up, and it did. My heart was racing as I grabbed my .22 rifle from the closet. I'm no action hero, but I wasn't about to let someone mess with the house. I figured a burglar had seen Mom and my sister leave and assumed the place was empty. I crept upstairs, trying to be as quiet as a 200-pound guy can be. It was pitch dark, and every creak of the stairs made me wince. I made it to the living room and positioned myself behind the couch, rifle ready, listening for any sign of an intruder. For 5 minutes, though it felt like an eternity, I waited. No footsteps, no breathing, no shuffling, just silence. Finally, I started turning on the lights, one by one, checking every corner of the house. I went through every room, every closet, every window, and every door. I made sure the blinds were shut tight, blocking any view from outside. Everything was in place. Nothing stolen, nothing disturbed. But then I found something. In my sister's room, behind a thick curtain, the far right window was slightly open. It's the one that faces the street, hidden from view unless you're looking for it. The motion sensors don't cover that far out, so someone could have been lurking on the patio just beyond the window's reach. My stomach dropped. I know that window was supposed to be locked. We checked every one when we installed the security system. I closed it, latched it tight, and stood there staring at it. Maybe someone had tested it, trying to see if they could get in. That's what I told myself. It was 3 a.m. by then, and every light in the house was on. I was exhausted, rattled, and just wanted to sleep before work. I turned off the lights, crawled back into bed, and pulled the blanket over me, trying to shake off the unease. But as I settled in, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of Mom's footsteps. The creak of her bed frame, the steady steps crossing her room, heading toward the living room. My blood ran cold. I lay there, frozen, my mind racing. Had I missed something? Was someone actually in the house? I grabbed the .22 again and bolted upstairs faster than I thought possible. I flipped on the living room light, expecting to catch someone red-handed. But there was nothing. The living room was empty, Mom's bedroom doors still closed. Nobody was there. The time between hearing the steps and reaching the living room was maybe 15 seconds, too short for someone to vanish without a trace. I checked the doors, the windows, everything. All secure, no sign of anyone. I barely slept that night, and it didn't stop there. Every night since, around 3 a.m., I hear those same footsteps. A few days before Mom and my sister were due back, something changed. Instead of stopping in the living room, the steps kept going, down the stairs toward my room. I'm sitting at my PC now, typing this out. It's warm in here, but I'm on edge, waiting for those steps to start again. I don't know if there's a burglar hiding somewhere in the house or if it's something else entirely. I've started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, but I tell myself it's just sleep deprivation. I hope to God it's just the floorboards. I really do. Let me start with some context. Despite the strange events I'm about to share, this camping trip was still a great experience. My parents split amicably when I was very young, and while I didn't live with my dad, I got to see him regularly. Trips like this one were our way of bonding, and they were always fun. I don't want these creepy moments to overshadow the good memories, but they're worth telling because they've stuck with me all these years. When I was about 9 or 10, my dad and stepmom rented a tiny cabin in northern Ontario for a summer getaway through a family friend. I don't know the exact location, but it was well north of Midland, which is part of what Canadians call cottage country, a popular area for vacation homes and retreats, especially for folks from Toronto. For my American readers, think of it like heading up to a remote lake in the Adirondacks or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This cabin sat on a lake, and the only way to get there was by a small motorboat, ferried by the property owner. It wasn't on an island, but there were no roads leading to it, just dense forest and water, which made it feel isolated in the best way. The cabin was rustic but cozy, and we had a blast exploring the lake and surrounding woods. I was obsessed with wildlife as a kid, frogs, fish, you name it, so this place was paradise. The lake was surrounded by marshes, teeming with critters, and I couldn't get enough of it. Here are the strange things that happened during the trip, broken down into specific moments to make it easier to follow. I'm not a professional writer, so bear with me as I try to piece it all together. Humming in the marsh. The owner left a canoe at the cabin, and we took it out almost every day, usually in the late afternoon or evening. I loved paddling through the marshes, spotting frogs and fish darting through the reeds. One evening, as the sun was setting, we were gliding back through a marsh when I heard a faint humming sound, like the low buzz of a transformer or electrical box. It came from the tree line on the shore, maybe 100 feet away. My dad and stepmom heard it too, and we all stopped paddling to listen. The sound grew louder, almost pulsing, then stopped abruptly. What made it eerie was that everything else stopped too. No birds chirping, no frogs croaking, no rustling of leaves. The marsh, usually alive with noise, went dead silent. We waited, expecting something else to happen, but nothing did. We paddled back to the cabin, a little spooked but unharmed. The silence stuck with me, though. It was unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath, muscles and a strange figure. The cabin sat on a rocky, steep shoreline, not a sandy beach like you might picture. Once you waded into the water, though, it was a different world, full of freshwater mussels and crayfish hiding among the rocks. My dad, who's not exactly a survivalist but is clever and resourceful, got the idea to catch some mussels to cook. Spoiler: freshwater mussels taste awful, like muddy rubber. Don't try it. We canoed to a sandy spot near the shore to gather them, wading in the shallow water. On both sides of this spot, the shore rose sharply into cliffs, maybe 2 stories high, topped with thick forest. While we were splashing around, I caught a glimpse of something moving among the trees on the opposite shore. It was white, almost like birch bark, and lanky, taller than a person but not quite human-shaped. It staggered slowly, almost limping, like it was injured or not fully in control of its movements. I couldn't make out details, but it gave me the creeps. I pointed it out to my dad, saying, "Look up there." By the time he looked, it was gone. On our way back to the cabin, I swore I saw it again on the opposite shore, moving the same way. I was young, so I've always wondered if I imagined it, but the memory is so vivid, I'm not sure. It didn't feel like a person or any animal I knew. The dead peninsula. Another time, my dad's stepmom and I took the canoe to a small peninsula on the other side of the lake, near the marshes. We dragged the canoe onto a narrow strip of shoreline and walked inland, single file, through a sparse forest. There was no clear path, but the trees weren't too dense, so we could still see the water behind us. As we walked, we noticed something odd. The ground was covered in mushrooms, more than I'd ever seen, and the trees started to change. The healthy, green pines gave way to dead, fallen ones, their bark gray and peeling. It didn't look like a fire had swept through. There were no burn marks, just death, like the life had been sucked out of the area. The air grew heavy, and a foul smell, like rot or decay, hit us. My dad, trying not to scare me, suggested we turn back, saying it wasn't safe to go farther. Later, he admitted it freaked him out. He didn't want to let on at the time because I was just a kid, but the place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. We avoided that peninsula for the rest of the trip. The silent hike. This one I didn't witness myself. My dad told me about it years later. He went hiking alone one day, deeper into the woods behind a cabin. At some point, everything around him stopped. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. Total silence, like the world had paused. It lasted about a minute before the normal sounds of the forest returned, and nothing else happened during his hike. It wasn't terrifying, but it added to the strange vibe of the trip, like the woods were watching us. The humming at night. Most nights, we'd have a fire outside and relax. One night, my dad and I stayed up late watching the X-Files on a tiny black and white TV. I have no idea how the cabin had power, maybe a generator or small solar setup, since there were no roads or power lines nearby. It only ran a few lights, the TV, and a water pump, so it wasn't exactly high-tech. The X-Files was spooky enough for a kid, But during one episode, we heard that same humming sound from the canoe trip. It was faint, coming from somewhere outside, maybe in the woods. We grabbed a flashlight and stepped out to investigate, but we couldn't see anything. The sound was too far away to pinpoint, and neither of us was eager to wander into the dark woods or take the canoe out at night. We went back inside, and the humming continued on and off, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter. In the morning, we found the water wasn't working. My dad checked and discovered the pump's power cable had been tampered with, not cut, but loosened, like someone or something had messed with it. It was an easy fix, but it left us uneasy. The face at the window. This is the one that haunts me the most. I was an early riser on that trip, excited to go out and catch toads, frogs, or even chipmunks. I set a trap once and caught a chipmunk, which was the highlight of my week. One morning, just before sunrise, I woke up but stayed in bed, staring out the window next to me. That's when I saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. Half a face peering around the edge of the window, looking into the cabin. It was sickly pale, almost orange, with huge, black, empty holes where eyes should have been. It wasn't human, not even close. I froze, my heart pounding, and dove under the covers, too scared to move. I stayed there until my dad and stepmom woke up. When I finally peeked out, it was gone. There was no sign of anything outside, no footprints, no marks. I've always tried to convince myself I imagined it, maybe half dreaming after waking up, but it felt so real. The image is burned into my mind. Years later, when I was visiting my home city, I met up with my dad, and we got to talking about that trip. He mentioned feeling uneasy at the cabin, more than he'd let on at the time. He usually jogged early in the morning, habit he's kept for years, but he skipped it a few times because something about the place creeped him out. He couldn't explain it, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. When he said that, I thought back to the face at the window, and it hit me harder than ever. I don't share these stories often. Honestly, I rarely talk about them at all. I can't prove any of it happened, but it stayed with me, and I'm sharing it now because it feels like something worth putting out there. That trip was amazing, but those moments, they were straight up unsettling. This story comes from my second visit to Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a place with a dark history as a former tuberculosis hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. For those unfamiliar, Waverly Hills is notorious in the U.S. for being one of the most haunted locations, drawing paranormal enthusiasts and thrill seekers. Its massive, decaying structure and grim past, thousands died there during the TB epidemic, make it a hotspot for ghost tours and investigations. I went with two of my cousins and a friend of one of my cousins. A few strange things happened that night, but one experience stood out as the most intense, and it's what I'm sharing here. We had just finished walking a mother and her daughter back to the main exit after a portion of the tour. The exit area had restrooms, so we took a quick break to use the facilities and regroup. The first floor of the sanatorium was decked out for their annual haunted house event, which happens around Halloween. The walls were splattered with fake blood and spooky decorations, and props like coffins and mannequins were stored in many of the rooms. It made the first floor feel more like a cheesy theme park than a place of genuine paranormal activity, so we didn't linger there. We figured the real eerie stuff would happen on the upper floors, where the hospital's history felt more raw and untouched. My two cousins and I decided to head back up to the fourth floor, where we'd heard some of the creepiest stories about the sanatorium. For context, Waverly Hills is an open-air building with large windows and no modern climate control, so it's exposed to the elements. It's also outside the main city of Louisville, in a more rural area, and that night there was a full moon casting a surprising amount of light into the building. Combine that with exterior security lights and a glowing red exit sign scattered throughout, and you could usually see pretty well, even in the middle of the night. It wasn't like you needed a flashlight to navigate, though we carried them just in case. As we approached the staircase to head upstairs, something felt off. The hallway leading to the stairs was unusually dark, like the light from the moon and exterior lamps wasn't reaching it. Half of the corridor was pitch black, a kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything. We shrugged it off at first, chalking it up to a trick of the shadows or maybe a burned-out exterior light. We pressed on, climbing the stairs toward the fourth floor. But within a few minutes, as we walked down the fourth-floor hallway, the darkness became overwhelming. I couldn't see anything, not the walls, not my cousins walking beside me, not even my own hand when I held it up in front of my face. It was disorienting, like being submerged in ink. We stopped, instinctively grabbing onto each other's arms to stay connected. No one said a word. It was a silent agreement to just hold still and wait it out. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and I could feel my pulse quickening as the seconds ticked by. I don't know how long we stood there. Probably only a couple of minutes, though it felt much longer. But the silence and darkness were suffocating. Then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through from behind us. "What are you doing?" We spun around, hearts racing, and saw a tour guide standing there, his flashlight casting a dim glow. Suddenly, we could see again. The hallway was no longer pitch black. The moonlight and exit signs were visible, just as they should have been. We explained that we'd stopped because we couldn't see a thing, not even our own hands. The guide gave us a skeptical look, like he thought we were exaggerating or spooked ourselves into seeing things. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized we'd walked past a bright red exit sign in several rooms, including a large open area that should have been flooded with light from the city and the moon. There were at least 6 rooms we'd passed, all with open windows, and we hadn't seen any of them. It didn't make sense. How could we have missed all that light? The 3 of us exchanged glances, shaken, but trying to play it cool. We decided it was weird but not worth dwelling on, so we continued toward the stairs to explore the higher floors. As we moved on, we ran into a larger group from the tour, led by another guide. He was in the middle of explaining the types of shadow entities people report seeing at Waverly Hills. Most were typical ghost stories, fleeting shapes, vague figures in doorways, but the last one he described caught our attention. He called it Big Black, a massive shadow that could settle over an entire hallway, plunging it into a deep, unnatural darkness. He warned that if we ever saw it, we should turn around and go the other way. My cousins and I burst out laughing, not mocking, but nervous, almost giddy laughter. The timing was too perfect. The guide got irritated, thinking we were dismissing the whole thing as fake. We quickly assured him we weren't laughing, because we thought it was nonsense. We told him we'd just experienced that exact darkness, the kind that made no sense given the moonlight and exit signs. We described how we couldn't see anything, not even each other, till his colleague showed up. The guide's expression softened, but he didn't say much, just nodded and moved on with his talk. The rest of the night was uneventful compared to that moment, but the experience stuck with us. The idea of Big Black wasn't just a spooky story. It felt like we'd walked right into it. The sanatorium's history, with its thousands of deaths and lingering pain, seemed to hang in the air, and that hallway felt like a glimpse into something beyond explanation. We didn't see any ghosts or hear any voices after that, but the memory of that suffocating darkness has stayed with me, vivid and unsettling, like a shadow that doesn't quite fade. I stood frozen in front of a gap in the chain-link fence, the only way in or out of the abandoned HMS base. My heart pounded as I stared into the darkness, trying to gauge what lay ahead. The base, a derelict military compound on the coast, was shrouded in mist rolling in from the sea, and the dim light pollution from the nearby city barely pierced the gloom. For American readers, think of it like an old naval yard, long forgotten, with crumbling buildings and a reputation for eerie happenings, similar to something you'd find in a ghost hunting show set in a place like Mare Island or the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I weighed the danger of what I was about to do. I only had a vague sense of the risks, but I felt compelled to find answers to the unsettling events that had plagued me since that first night at the base. I needed closure to put my fears to rest. Steeling myself, I focused on my breathing, slipped through the fence, and headed toward the CRT room, my senses on high alert. The soft crash of waves against the shore made it hard to distinguish ambient sounds from potential threats, so I strained to hear anything out of place. A footstep, a rustle, anything. When I reached the door of the CRT room, a small concrete structure tucked among the larger buildings, I scanned the area with my flashlight. To my surprise, there was no padlock or chain securing the door. It creaked open easily, which sent a chill down my spine. It felt like someone was expecting me. The room was small but unsettling, its walls covered not with old CRT monitors, as the name suggested, but with strange, jagged symbols scrawled in thick black ink. To me, they looked like occult sigils, the kind you'd see in horror movies about rituals gone wrong. Swirling lines, angular shapes, and cryptic marks that seemed to pulse in the beam of my flashlight. At the back of the room stood a desk, cluttered with papers, newspaper clippings, and other documents strewn across its surface. I shuffled over, my boots scuffing the dusty floor, and started sifting through the mess. On top was a scrap of paper with a handwritten note that made my blood run cold. Tonight is the night. My fears spiked, a primal dread I'd never felt before. It was like every horror story I'd ever heard was converging on this moment, and I was the unlucky protagonist. My mind raced, picturing a lost child crying in the dark, surrounded by unseen monsters, abandoned and helpless. But I pushed through the panic and moved the note aside, revealing a yellowed newspaper article from the local paper, dated about 40 years ago. The headline read, "Body parts found scattered at HMS base," accompanied by a grainy photo of the base's entrance. The article described how parts of a single body, identified through DNA as belonging to a man named Richard, were found in different buildings across the compound. Disturbingly, the head was never recovered. The name Richard hit me like a shockwave. It was the same Richard we'd heard about during an earlier urban exploration trip, when we'd used a Ouija board in this very base. The board had spelled out his name, and the session had left us all rattled, feeling a heavy, oppressive energy. I couldn't shake the thought that this was no coincidence. What did Richard's death have to do with what was happening to me now? I slid the article aside and found a collage of smaller headlines, each reporting a different suicide at the base, with a larger headline in the center: "Base closes amid rising suicides and mental health crisis." The smaller articles detailed how 60% of the suicides were committed by members of the public who broke onto the property, while 40% were base staff, often found in restricted areas. The central article noted that the base shut down due to an alarming increase in suicides and cases of manic depression among personnel. Why were so many people drawn to end their lives here, of all places? I checked the dates on the articles. Every suicide occurred after Richard's death, which stood out because his death wasn't a suicide. The article about him described body parts scattered in multiple buildings, suggesting a brutal murder rather than self-inflicted harm. I pulled his article back to reread it, searching for missed details, but it was sparse. Just the facts about the dismembered remains and the lack of a head. Something was off, though. I'd lived in this city my whole life and had researched its history extensively, especially its abandoned sites. Yet I'd never come across these articles before. Were they even real? Digging deeper, I lifted a paper folder from the pile, and 2 photographs slipped out, falling to the floor. I picked them up, my stomach churning. Each showed a severed limb, one a leg, the other an arm, marked with a black inked symbol identical to those on the walls. I didn't linger on the images. The sight was enough to confirm they were real and gruesome. Inside the folder, I found photos of the other limbs and a torso, each with a different symbol. No head, though, just like the article said. I assumed these belonged to Richard. Tucked in the folder was an A4 size sheet, a rough blueprint to the base with 5 red crosses marked on it, indicating where the body parts were found: one in the L-shaped building, one in the gate operator's building, one in the sea-facing large building, one in the big building where we'd heard loud bangs during our first visit, and one in the center of the compound. A realization hit me like a freight train. If you connected the crosses and drew a circle around them, they formed a pentagram, a 5-pointed star often associated with occult rituals in Western folklore, like something out of a supernatural thriller. This wasn't just a murder. It felt like a deliberate, ritualistic act. My imagination ran wild, picturing a ceremony that had cursed the entire base, explaining the suicides and the oppressive atmosphere we'd felt during our first trip. The fear, the negativity, the way the air seemed to weigh us down, it all tied back to this. But one piece was missing: Richard's head. The blueprint gave no clue to its location, and I studied it closely, hoping for a hint, but found nothing. As I shook my head to refocus, my eyes landed on something familiar in the corner of the room. Something that didn't belong, a brown antique box, eerily similar to one we'd taken from this base during our first exploration. Next to it, ready to be used, was the Ouija board we'd brought that night. My heart stopped. That board was supposed to be at my house, locked away after our terrifying session. How was it here? I shuffled over, my legs heavy with dread, and opened the box. Inside was a human skull, gleaming in the flashlight's beam, with a black symbol drawn on its forehead, matching the ones on the walls and photos. This had to be Richard's skull, the missing piece they'd never found. Why hadn't my friend, who'd taken the box, told us about this? Had he seen the skull, the symbols, the articles? Why keep it secret? My shock spilled out in a whisper as I muttered questions to myself, trying to make sense of it all. Then a voice answered from behind me, cold and familiar. Why did you not tell us about the black ghost you saw? Before I could turn, a sharp pain sliced through my ankle, and I collapsed, my flashlight clattering to the floor. Blood gushed from my Achilles tendon, warm and sticky, as I writhed in agony. I swung the flashlight up, catching the glint of a metal blade dripping with my blood. Holding it was my friend, the one who'd taken the box, the one who'd been with us that first night. His face was blank, his eyes empty, like he wasn't himself. My body went numb from shock and blood loss, and as my vision blurred, I realized I'd stumbled into something far darker than I could have imagined. The base wasn't just haunted, it was alive with secrets, and I'd walked right into its trap. Back when I was 19, I lived with my mom in a single-story ranch-style house on a quiet road that backed up to a large open field. For American readers, picture a typical suburban home with a long, low profile, common in rural or semi-rural areas. On the other side of the field was a main highway, buzzing with occasional traffic. About half a mile down the road in one direction lived a loner farmer, known for keeping to himself. In the other direction, about a mile away, was a rundown house that everyone in the area whispered was a crack house. It was dilapidated, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds, and the people who hung around there kept a low profile, so they didn't cause much trouble. Beyond those two houses, our stretch of road was pretty isolated, with no close neighbors or streetlights, just fields and the distant hum of the highway. At the time, I was juggling a full-time job and a full load of college classes. One of my classes ended late, around 10:30 p.m., so on that day of the week, I wouldn't get home until about 11:15 p.m. The drive was usually uneventful, just me cruising down the dark road, headlights cutting through the night. But one night, something caught my eye. As I drove toward home, I spotted a guy walking along the side of the road. He wore a bright yellow shirt and track pants, an outfit that stood out, not just because it was garish, but because it seemed out of place for a late-night stroll. It wasn't unusual to see people walking around, given the crack house nearby, so I didn't think much of it at first. But as I passed him, I instinctively glanced over, and he turned, locking eyes with me. He smiled a wide, unsettling grin and waved. It sent a shiver down my spine, like he knew something I didn't. I pressed the gas a little harder, speeding the half-mile to our driveway, my heart beating faster than it should have been. When I pulled into the driveway, I was already on edge. In my rush to get inside, I forgot to grab my phone from the car's center console, a mistake I'd regret later. I locked the car, hurried to the front door, and went inside, double-checking that all the doors and windows were secure. Our house had a front door facing the road and a side door leading to the driveway, both with deadbolts. I flipped on the porch light, which had a motion sensor, and sat on the couch, trying to shake off the paranoia. I kept an eye on the front window, half expecting to see that guy in the yellow shirt walk by. People from the crack house sometimes wandered past, but he didn't show. Instead, something worse happened. As I sat there, peering through the blinds, I saw two figures step into the driveway. One was the guy in a yellow shirt, his silhouette unmistakable under the glow of the porch light. The other was a man in darker clothes, harder to make out. They weren't just passing by. They were messing with my car, tugging at the door handles and peering inside. My stomach dropped. I realized my phone was still in the car, probably what they were after, but I couldn't be sure. Then the guy in the yellow shirt started walking toward the front door, his steps slow and deliberate. Panic set in. I bolted to my mom's room to wake her up. Mom was groggy, rubbing her eyes as I tried to explain the situation in a frantic whisper. There's two guys outside, messing with my car, and one's coming to the door. I stammered. Before she could respond, we both froze. The front doorknob turned slowly, the faint creak of metal echoing in a quiet house. Thank God it was deadbolt. Mom snapped awake, her face hardening. She got out of bed, and I perched on the couch, peeking through the blinds to keep an eye on the guy in the yellow shirt, now standing on the porch. His friend stayed in the driveway, pacing, his head swiveling like he was keeping watch. The porch light was still on, casting harsh shadows across their faces. "Who's there?" Mom called out, her voice firm but calm. I whispered that I'd left my phone in the car but had my wallet in my purse, which was on the kitchen counter. Mom nodded and spoke through the door. "I've got a wallet if that's what you're after, but it's too late to be knocking on people's doors." Her tone was steady, like she was scolding a neighbor kid, but I could see her hands trembling. The guy in the yellow shirt responded, his voice low and eerily casual. "Okay, I'm not a bad guy, just so you know." The words hung in the air, and nobody moved. Not him, not his friend, not us. The porch light flicked off as the motion sensor timed out, plunging the porch into darkness. Then the doorknob turned again, slower this time, like he was testing it. My heart was in my throat. Mom turned to me, whispering, "Call the cops." I admitted I didn't have my phone, and her face tightened. She strode to the kitchen, grabbed her phone from the charger, and handed it to me. Then she disappeared into her room. I dialed 911, my hand shaking as I explained to the dispatcher that two suspicious guys were at our door, one trying to get in. As I spoke, I kept my eyes on the window, watching the two men. Mom reappeared, holding her Ruger, a small handgun she kept in a lockbox for emergencies. She'd checked the bathroom window earlier, the one facing the backyard, and now she muttered, "Backyard?" I froze, realizing what she meant. She'd glimpsed someone else out there, probably from the kitchen window, and had gone to the bathroom for a better look. The idea of a third person lurking in the shadows made my skin crawl. Mom marched back to the front door, gripping the Ruger, and raised her voice. "Try that handle again." And I'm opening the door and shooting. I don't know why she didn't just wait for the cops. Maybe she was fed up, maybe she wanted to scare them off, but it worked. The guy in the yellow shirt bolted, his friend sprinting after him. I watched them tear down the road toward the crack house, their figures fading into the dark. I relayed the update to the dispatcher, my voice shaking. Mom rushed to the bathroom window again, peering into the backyard. She said the third guy must have seen his friends running and took off too, heading the same way. The cops arrived about 15 minutes later, sweeping the house and yard with flashlights. They found nothing out of place, no footprints, no signs of tampering beyond the car handles. Then they headed to the crack house, where they found 5 guys hanging out. One was the guy in the yellow shirt, and I'm pretty sure his friends were among them. They were arrested, though I never learned the exact charges. Maybe trespassing, maybe something more serious. Either way, nothing like that ever happened again. I was on edge for weeks, jumping at every noise, checking the locks obsessively. Even now, living in a much nicer area, I double-check every door and window day or night. It's a habit I can't shake. The whole thing could have ended worse, but the cops got the guys, and we were safe. Still, the memory of that doorknob turning, that creepy smile, and the thought of someone lurking in the backyard, it stayed with me, sharp and unsettling, all these years later. I still get goosebumps every time I think about that night. It's been over a year now, but every detail is burned into my memory like it happened yesterday. I've been in therapy ever since, and my psychiatrist suggested writing it all down might help me process it. So here I am trying to make sense of it all. I was 17 back then, living with my mom and stepdad in one of those grim, gray apartment blocks left over from the communist era. If you're not from the Balkans, you might not know what these neighborhoods look like. Endless rows of identical concrete buildings, paint flaking off, graffiti scrawled everywhere. Our city had some nicer areas, but our corner of town was rough, neglected, and far from charming. That night, I couldn't sleep. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I decided to sneak out to meet some friends to smoke weed behind the playground. Looking back, it sounds reckless, but that's just what we did back then. Hanging out in sketchy places, chasing small thrills to escape the boredom. My mom would have grounded me for life if she caught me sneaking out that late, but I was restless, wired, and my friends were already waiting. I pulled on my hoodie, grabbed my old iPhone 7, and crept out of our apartment, careful not to let the door creak. The hallways in those buildings always reeked of stale cabbage and cigarette smoke, a smell that clung to everything. The elevator was, as usual, out of order. It rarely worked, so I trudged down 8 flights of stairs, my sneakers scuffing against the worn concrete steps. When I stepped outside, the air hit me like a damp slap. It wasn't freezing, but it was that kind of raw, bone-chilling cold that seeps under your skin. The streetlights in our neighborhood were a sad joke. Half of them broken, the rest casting a weak, yellowish glow that barely lit the cracked sidewalks. But I knew the route by heart, so I started walking, hands shoved deep in my pockets, put up to shield my face from the chill. I took the shortcut through the maze of alleys behind the buildings. Even in daylight, those alleys were creepy, narrow, littered with trash, flanked by towering concrete walls that seemed to swallow sound. But I'd walked that path 100 times before, so I didn't think twice. I checked my phone, 3:48 a.m. I quickened my pace, knowing Marco and Ivana would be waiting and probably annoyed if I was late. That's when I saw her. I was passing a particularly narrow alley when something caught my eye, a small figure standing in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a pile of trash bags or maybe a stray dog. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized it was a little girl, standing perfectly still, clutching a ball. My heart skipped a beat. What was a kid, maybe 8 or 10 years old, doing out here at this hour? I couldn't make out her face in the darkness, but her silhouette was clear enough. A small frame in what looked like a jacket, her head slightly tilted as if she were staring at something I couldn't see. Every horror movie I'd ever watched screamed at me to keep walking, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't just ignore her. What if she was lost? What if something terrible had happened to her? This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you left a kid alone at 4 a.m. So against every instinct, I stepped closer, moving slowly so I wouldn't scare her. "Hey," I said softly, trying to sound calm and gentle. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. She didn't even move. She just stood there, her small figure frozen in place, the ball still gripped tightly in her hands. I thought maybe she was terrified of me, a random teenager in a hoodie creeping up on her in the middle of the night. I crouched down to seem less intimidating. "What's your name?" I asked. "Do you live around here? I can help you get home." Still nothing. Just an unnerving silence, and the faint sense of her eyes locked on me, though I couldn't see them clearly in the dark. I started to wonder if I was freaking her out. I probably looked like a mess, bloodshot eyes from staying up all night gaming, clothes rumpled, and I was planning to smoke weed, so I didn't exactly scream trustworthy. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at my face to show her I wasn't some creep. "See? I'm just a guy trying to help," I said, forcing a smile. That's when things went wrong. I swung the flashlight toward where she'd been standing, but she was gone. Just gone. The alley was empty, the beam of light revealing nothing but cracked pavement and a rusty dumpster. I swept the light around, my pulse quickening, thinking she must have darted away. I even checked behind the dumpster, half expecting to find her hiding. Nothing. Just the stale smell of garbage and the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. I stood there frozen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had I imagined her? I hadn't been sleeping well lately, and I knew my anxiety could mess with my head when I was exhausted. I had moments before where I thought I saw things that weren't there, shadows moving, shapes in the corner of my eye. I tried to convince myself it was just my brain playing tricks, a stress-induced hallucination. I forced a shaky laugh, imagining how Marco and Ivana would crack up when I told them I'd been spooked by a ghost kid. I started walking again, but the air felt different now, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The silence was too thick, broken only by the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. Then I heard it, more footsteps, light and quick, trailing just behind me. I stopped dead. The extra steps stopped too, a split second after mine, like someone was mimicking me. I whipped around, shining my phone's flashlight down the empty alley. Nothing. Just the same cracked pavement and graffiti-covered walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. I started walking again, faster this time, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps came back, soft, pattering, like a child running to keep up. I spun around again, flashlight shaking in my hand. Still nothing. My breath was coming in short gasps now, and I could feel sweat prickling my back despite the cold. I told myself it was just an echo, my own steps bouncing weirdly off the buildings, but deep down, I didn't believe it. Something was following me. Then came the whispering. It started so faintly I thought it was the wind, but the air was dead still that night. No breeze, no rustling leaves. The whispers grew louder, and the strangest part was that I could hear them clearly, but couldn't make out the words. It was a child's voice, high and soft, but the sounds were wrong, garbled, like someone playing a recording backward. My skin crawled, and I broke into a near run, the whispers chasing me through the alleys, weaving in and out of the silence like a thread. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice echoing too loudly in the empty streets. It's not real. I dealt with anxiety attacks before, moments where my chest felt like it was caving in, where I thought I was dying. My doctor had warned me that stress and sleep deprivation could trigger hallucinations, make me hear things that weren't there. I clung to that explanation, desperate to believe this was just my mind screwing with me. I stopped in the middle of the street, crouched down, and pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "It's not real," I muttered over and over, like a mantra. "It's not real." I focused on my breathing, just like my therapist taught me. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. Slowly, the whispers faded, and the world went quiet again. My heartbeat steadied, and I cautiously uncovered my ears. Silence. I opened my eyes, stood up, and she was there, right in front of me. The little girl. But she wasn't like before. This time, I could see her clearly, even though the streetlight above us was barely flickering. Her eyes were pitch black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye like twin voids in her pale face. Her mouth hung open, white foam or some kind of liquid dribbling down her chin, staining the front of her black dress. Over it, she wore a pink jacket slightly too big for her small frame, but she still clutched that damn ball. Our eyes locked, or at least I stared into those empty black holes, and something inside me shattered. It wasn't just fear. It was like every ounce of terror I'd ever felt in my life had been distilled into that moment, crushing my chest, stealing my breath. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't think. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, curling into a ball, hugging my knees as tightly as I could. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking back and forth on the cold pavement, convinced that if I looked up, she'd be inches from my face, those black eyes boring into me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, minutes, maybe, though it felt like hours. I was trapped in a haze of panic, my mind looping on those eyes, that foam, that unnatural stillness. I only snapped out of it when I felt hands on my shoulders and heard voices calling my name. I flinched so hard I nearly fell over, my eyes flying open. 2 middle-aged men stood over me, their faces etched with concern. They were neighbors, they said, coming home from a late shift at the factory when they found me huddled in the middle of the street. "Are you okay, kid? Are you hurt?" One of them asked, his voice gruff but kind. I couldn't speak at first. I just pointed to where the girl had been, my hand trembling. But the spot was empty, the alley as lifeless as before. "Did someone attack you?" the other man asked, scanning the shadows. I tried to explain about the girl, but the words tumbled out in a jumbled, hysterical mess. They probably thought I was high or having some kind of breakdown. One of them pulled out his phone to call the police while the other stayed with me, awkwardly patting my shoulder and murmuring, "It's going to be okay, kid." I refused to move from that spot, terrified that if I stood up, I'd see her again. Even when the police arrived, I wouldn't budge, my knees still locked to my chest. The officers were surprisingly patient, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders and handing me a bottle of water. They asked gentle questions, but I could barely string a sentence together. They called my parents, but my mom didn't answer. She takes sleeping pills and sleeps like the dead. My stepdad showed up around 6 a.m., his face pale and drawn. I braced myself for a lecture, but he didn't yell. He just looked at me, his eyes wide with something like fear, and helped me into the car. The ride home was silent. I couldn't bring myself to explain what happened without sounding insane, so I mumbled something about getting spooked and having a panic attack. He didn't push, just nodded and kept his eyes on the road. In the weeks that followed, I fell apart. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those black voids staring back. Nightmares woke me screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat. My grades tanked, and I stopped hanging out with friends. I barely left my room. My mom finally dragged me to a psychiatrist after she found me sitting in the bathtub at 3 a.m., fully clothed, too terrified to go back to my bedroom. 2 months later, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder. The doctor said what I saw was likely a hallucination, triggered by stress, lack of sleep, and my undiagnosed conditions. They prescribed meds that leave me feeling like I'm wading through fog, but at least I don't see things anymore. My mom's convinced the diagnosis explains everything. My stepdad never brings up that night. Only my boyfriend, Luca, believes me when I say it was real. He dug into local legends and found stories about a girl who died in our neighborhood back in the 1980s. She'd been chasing a ball into the street when a car hit her. Some locals swore they'd seen her since, always holding a ball, always appearing late at night in the alleys. We don't live in that apartment anymore. My mom and I moved across town after I got out of the hospital to a brighter, newer place that doesn't smell like despair. But I'm still broken. I can't walk alone at night. I avoid alleys, my heart racing at the sight of shadows. I sleep with the lights on, a habit that drives my mom crazy. My psychiatrist says writing this might help me accept it as a hallucination, not reality. But I know what I saw. The meds keep the visions at bay, but they can't erase the memory of those black eyes, that whisper trailing me through the empty streets. Sometimes I wake up at exactly 3:48 a.m., the time I saw her first. And sometimes, just for a split second, I swear I hear the soft bounce of a ball in the hallway outside my room. I still can't sleep through the night. It's been 3 weeks since that rainy evening, but every time I close my eyes, I see her face in my rearview mirror. I've been driving taxis in Taipei for nearly 15 years, and you hear all kinds of tales in this line of work. Ghost passengers, phantom hitchhikers, stories drivers swap to kill time on slow shifts. I always laugh them off as urban legends, nothing more. I'm not laughing anymore. It happened last month during that massive storm that battered the city. April in Taipei can be rainy, but this was something else entirely. The rain pounded down so hard it sounded like someone was hurling buckets of water at my windshield. My wipers were on full blast, but they could barely keep up, and I could see maybe 10 feet ahead at best. It was close to midnight, and I was ready to call it a night. Most folks had the sense to stay indoors, and I'd only had a handful of fares all evening, hardly worth the hassle of navigating flooded streets. I was cruising along Bingjiang Street near the Tsihui Tunnel when my dispatch radio crackled to life. A pickup request came through for a spot just outside the tunnel entrance. I almost ignored it. That area gets eerily quiet at night, especially in weather like this, and the tunnel itself has a reputation, whispers of accidents and strange sightings. But money was tight. My wife had been stressing about our savings, and with her daughter's university tuition looming, I couldn't afford to be picky. So I flicked on my on-duty light and headed toward the tunnel, the rain hammering my cab like a drum. As I neared the pickup spot, I almost missed her. She stood just beyond the tunnel exit, a lone figure in a downpour. No umbrella, no coat, just standing there, soaked to the bone. My headlights caught her, and I pulled over to the curb. She looked young, maybe 25, dressed in a simple white blouse and dark skirt, both clinging to her frame from the rain. Her long hair was plastered to her face, and she was shivering, but she didn't run from the storm or seek shelter. She just stood there, staring straight ahead, like she was waiting for something or someone. Something felt off right away, but I chalked it up to the weather. Maybe her car had broken down, or she was in some kind of shock. I rolled down my window just enough to keep the rain out and called, "Miss, did you call for a taxi?" She didn't respond at first. Slowly, she turned her head toward me, her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Her face was pale, ghostly pale, though I figured it was just the cold and the rain. After a long pause, she nodded slightly and approached the car. When she opened the back door, a blast of frigid air hit me, colder than the rainy night should have been. The hair on my arm stood up, but I brushed it off, assuming my AC was cranked too high. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror as she settled into the back seat, water dripping from her clothes onto the upholstery. She took a long time to answer, still shivering, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft I strained to hear it over the rain. "Yangming District," she said, "near the old temple." Her voice was strange, hollow yet oddly melodic, like it didn't quite belong to the world around us. I punched the address into my GPS and pulled back onto the road, the tires sloshing through puddles. Normally, I chat with passengers. It's part of the job, keeps me awake during long night shifts. But something about her told me to stay quiet. The only sounds in the cab were the relentless rain on the roof and the steady drip of water from her clothes. My heater was on full blast, but the air kept getting colder, like the warmth was being sucked out of the car. I kept stealing glances at her in the mirror. She never moved, just stared out the window, her face perfectly still, her reflection in the glass almost translucent at times, like a smudged image on a foggy mirror. I told myself it was the rain streaking the windows, playing tricks with the streetlights. Another thing struck me as odd. She wasn't on her phone. Everyone's glued to their screens these days, especially younger people, but she sat there motionless, her eyes fixed on the passing city lights through the rain-streaked window. No texting, no scrolling, nothing. Just an unnatural stillness that made my skin prickle. The drive to Yangming District took about 40 minutes in that weather, the road slick and treacherous. Not once did she speak, cough, or shift in her seat. No normal passenger habits. The cold in the cab grew worse, and I found myself rubbing my hands together, trying to shake the chill that had settled into my bones. Finally, we turned onto a narrow street lined with old houses, the kind built in the 50s and 60s before Taipei's skyscrapers took over. They were modest, single-story homes, some well-kept, others showing their age. She leaned forward slightly, the first movement she'd made the entire trip, and pointed to a house set back from the road. It looked neglected compared to its neighbors, the paint peeling, the yard overgrown. No lights glowed inside. "Here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I pulled over and checked the meter. 450 new Taiwan dollars, about 15 US dollars. She glanced at the meter, then at me, her eyes catching the dim light in a way that made my stomach twist. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice clearer now, but still unnervingly soft. "I left my purse at work today. Could you wait here while I get money from inside? I won't be long." Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to tell her to forget the fare and let me get the hell out of there. But her eyes held this deep, aching sadness that tugged at me, made me feel like refusing would be cruel. Against my better judgment, I nodded. 5 minutes, I said, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. She gave me the faintest smile, barely a curve of her lips, and stepped out of the cab. I watched her walk toward the house, her wet clothes still dripping, her steps slow and measured. She didn't hurry to escape the rain, which was still coming down in sheets. She reached the front door, opened it without a key or a knock, and slipped inside, the darkness swallowing her. The moment she left, the temperature in the cab seemed to normalize. My heater finally kicked in, warming the air, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I checked the time, 12:47 a.m. I waited, the rain drumming on the roof, the minutes ticking by. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At 15, I started to get irritated. At 20, I was torn between cutting my losses and leaving or going to knock on the door. Finally, I decided to check. The rain had eased to a drizzle, so I jogged to the front door, trying to stay dry. Up close, the house looked even worse. Grimy windows, rotting wooden siding, a faint musty smell seeping from the porch. I knocked harder than I intended, the sound echoing in the quiet night. After a long moment, I heard shuffling inside. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man in his 80s, his thinning white hair disheveled, his face lined with deep wrinkles. He wore old-fashioned pajamas, and his eyes squinted at me like I'd woken him from a deep sleep. "Sorry to disturb you, sir," I said, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm the taxi driver." The young woman I dropped off said she was getting money for the fare. "It's been 20 minutes. The old man's expression shifted, not to anger or confusion, but to a profound sadness that made my gut clench. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his eyes welling with tears. "She came home again," he whispered, more to himself than to me. He turned and disappeared into the dark house, returning moments later with a worn leather wallet. He counted out 500 new Taiwan dollars and pressed the bills into my hand, his fingers ice cold. "Keep the change," he said. "Sir, I don't understand," I said, my voice unsteady. "Where is she? I need to make sure she's okay." The old man sighed, a sound heavy with grief. "My daughter died 12 years ago," he said, his voice breaking. "Car accident, coming home from work. It was raining, just like tonight." He paused, his gaze drifting past me toward my taxi. "But every time it rains like this, around midnight she comes home, just like she promised she always would." A chill ran through me, sharper than the cold of the night. I turned slowly to look at my taxi, and there she was, a faint outline in the back seat, staring out the window, just as she had during the drive. I must have gasped or made some sound, because the old man placed a hand on my shoulder. "Would you like to come in?" he asked gently. "My wife just made tea. You look like you could use some." I don't know why I said yes. Maybe shock, maybe curiosity, maybe the kindness in his voice. I stepped into the house, the air inside warm but heavy with the scent of old wood and incense. The living room was like a time capsule, faded furniture, walls lined with black and white photos, everything meticulously clean but frozen in another era. In one corner stood a small altar with a framed photograph of the young woman from my taxi. In the picture, she was smiling, radiant, wearing the same white blouse she'd had on tonight. Incense burned steadily in front of the photo, surrounded by offerings of fruit and small packages of her favorite snacks, as the old man explained. "Mr. Lin," he introduced himself, as his wife appeared from the kitchen. She was elderly too, her hands gnarled with arthritis, her eyes kind but tired. She didn't seem surprised to see a stranger in her home at this hour. When Mr. Lin explained why I was there, she nodded and poured me a cup of jasmine tea, the steam rising in delicate curls. "Maya always worries about inconveniencing people," she said, speaking of her daughter in the present tense. Even now. They showed me more photos of Maya, her as a child, laughing in a park, the teenager graduating high school, as a young woman standing proudly in her kindergarten classroom where she'd worked as a teacher. She'd been 23 when she died, killed in a head-on collision with a truck that lost control in the rain near Tsihuai Tunnel. The night before the accident, she'd promised her parents she'd always come home, no matter what. We didn't understand what she meant then, Mrs. Lin said, tears rolling down her cheeks, though her voice stayed steady. According to the Lins, about a month after Maya's funeral, on a stormy night much like this one, taxi drivers started showing up at their door. Each told the same story. They'd picked up a young woman near Tsihuai Tunnel, driven her to this address, and then she vanished. It had been happening for 12 years, always on heavy rain nights, always around midnight. Most drivers left when they realized she was gone, but a few, like me, came to the door seeking answers. I sat there, the tea untouched in my hands, trying to wrap my head around it. Part of me wanted to believe it was a prank or that the Lins were grieving parents clinging to a delusion. But I knew what I'd seen, the cold that clung to my cab, the way her reflection seemed to fade in the glass, the silhouette in my back seat even now, visible through the living room window. Mrs. Lin followed my gaze. "She can't come in," she said softly. "She never comes inside. She just waits. We think she's afraid of saying a final goodbye. Or maybe she can't move on because she's keeping her promise to always come home." I stayed for about an hour listening to their stories about Maya, her love for teaching, her habit of singing off-key, her stubborn kindness. The Lins weren't crazy or exploiting their loss. They were just parents who'd lost their only child and were given this strange, heartbreaking gift of seeing her return, even if they could never hold her again. When I finally stood to leave, Mr. Lin walked me to the door. "She'll be gone when you get back to your taxi," he said. "She always disappears before the driver returns. I think she's embarrassed she can't pay the fare." I glanced to the cab, and sure enough, the back seat was empty. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "Why do you think she does this?" I asked. "Why not just appear at your house? Why the taxi ride? Mr. Lin smiled sadly. We've wondered that for years. My wife thinks Maya wants to come home properly, the way she would have if she'd lived, not just appearing, but making the journey. He shrugged. Or maybe she's just trying to finish the trip she started that night, repeating it over and over. I drove home in silence, the meter off, the rain now a faint drizzle. When I got to my apartment, I hugged my wife and daughter tighter than usual, holding them until they squirmed and asked what was wrong. I couldn't sleep that night, Maya's face haunting my thoughts, her pale reflection flickering in my mind's eye. I've driven past Sihuai tunnel several times since, always in daylight, always with a knot in my stomach. I haven't taken a fare there at night, and I'm not sure I ever will. But sometimes, when I'm stuck in traffic and the rain starts to fall, I catch myself glancing in a rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there, staring out the window, still trying to make her way home. I don't know why Maya chose my taxi that night. I don't know if she's trapped in some endless loop, or if she's choosing to keep her promise to her parents. All I know is that the Lins are still waiting for their daughter, and somewhere between Sihuai Tunnel and that old house in Yangming, a young woman is still trying to find her way back.